And it's nearly actually impossible in a lot of senses to compete at those levels unless you're very determined and very stubborn.
Rue, start the show! This one's for the disruptors, the uncommon, the unconventional, the rebels. You're not here to take things lying down. Well, season 2 is about shaking things up. I'm Beatrice, and this is the Art of Branding podcast. Be ready, be badass. Let's shake some shit up.
Oh, heck yeah. We're about to shake up the perception of agencies and the traditional agency structure with today's guest. Chris Harris here is the co-founder of Impossible Machine, putting people first and disrupting the agency industry. Hell the frick yeah. I know one of your big beliefs is around the old agency model being dead. What do you define as the old model, and how do you see these things changing?
So much has changed in the last few years here. Much of it has been a result of kind of these structural things that happen, right? Like COVID came around and certainly had an impact on culture. It had a way on business and the way that we did things. It sort of changed our way of life in a lot of ways. With that also became a lot of stark realizations about the way things had always been. So the status quo, it was working pretty darn good, right, up until that point. And then I think when we were all sitting at home, kind of contemplating the world and life, I think a lot of maybe inconvenient truths came out about the way we were doing things. And so obviously with that came a shift to working from home. So everyone was working from their house. And then I think from there, we saw some interesting things happen. So in the direct-to-consumer space, which is primarily where I operate, there was a little bit of a boom cycle. Everyone was home. We were shopping online more, and a lot of brands and a lot of marketers were doing very well for themselves. And so I think it really proved in a lot of ways that the D2C model is really solid. And then so now we're kind of on the back end of that, right? And so for a lot of folks, there's been a return to office. There's kind of been a push, especially here in the States, for returning to business as usual. But what's happened is that now, because everyone's belts have tightened, and because the way that investment cycles have changed, and the way that VCs and the money folks evaluate organizations and their worth, there's been sort of this shift for thinking more in terms of profitability versus top-line revenue growth. And so what that means is that the entire way that we were doing business, which in 2018, I was working for agencies that were behind Peloton and their launch, Chewy, some of these bigger brands in the D2C space that were very heavily invested. The landscape has changed dramatically. And so the money is no longer cheap, and the scrutiny behind investor relations and the way that the money gets doled out has changed dramatically. So in my opinion, what an agency is, it's ripe for change. It's ripe for disruption. And so that's sort of where we find ourselves at that moment in time, in which we as agency operators, we sort of have to reevaluate where we're placing our biggest bets and how we're thinking about the organization that we run, not even necessarily how we do business, but it really comes down to the structural skeleton of the organization, the way that everyone within the organization interacts and works together. And so I think a lot of that has been heavily scrutinized, and that's part of what we want to do is really put our best thinking forward in terms of what an agency should be.
How would you say, like, okay, so they're more focused on those profits, like the end of the day, rather than the revenue. So like, does that mean that they're spending less, or they're spending more mindfully, or like, what's the shift there?
Yeah, so it goes even beyond what I just described, where there's a number of compounding factors, but essentially at its core, the fundamental sort of guiding light or the goalpost is really about cost reduction. And so what that means is that every brand owner or every investor is really pressing stakeholders and decision makers to cut costs. And they're willing to do that. However, it doesn't matter how, as long as we get a certain outcome. And that outcome is typically revolving around profitability. And so if that means we have to lay off a quarter of our staff, If that means we need to look for outsourcing options, we need to find cheaper labor, we need to find AI solutions. That is where everyone is sort of moving towards. And so when I reflect back on how, because I've worked at many agencies and many big agencies, there tends to be a pretty bloated organizational structure. And what that means is that there's a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of people that are maybe making big decisions, but they're not actually creating or producing things. And so when I thought about what model made the most sense for the time and place in which we find ourselves, it's really placing an emphasis and placing our biggest bets on practitioners, people that are bringing tons of experience and are actually in the day-to-day, in the weeds. They're experts in their fields. They know everything there is to know about their specific channels or their specific lane. And those are the people that we really want to push to the forefront, because oftentimes, too, in my experience, mid and upper level management, they maybe are not even privy to some of the issues and some of the biggest roadblocks that some of these practitioners and people that are on the front lines face. And so it's an interesting challenge to try to adapt to that.
We're going into a recession. We're going to a recession. It's really building on that fear mongering, I guess. Like, if the media can put negative things out there, sure, they will, right? Like, and a big thing that has just continued on has been this recession. And so in a way of thinking, like, if we're just going to keep on rolling with this, we're in a recession, we're going into a recession, we're going to a recession. Hell, like, we're probably already there, right? To be very realistic. And what I'm seeing in the market is not necessarily brands stepping back away from spending, but they're perhaps spending more wisely or more targeted in terms of that long term, like, hey, let's be remembered in the market. Let's stick down on things that will actually grind through despite like whatever might happen with the prices, etc., if they keep on going up and down. But like, to me, I think, a lot of it is just pushing on fear. And, what are we going to do? Post that, right? Post that like fear of like, hey, we're in a recession. We're in a recession. It's been a while now of this being said. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I actually completely agree with what you just said. And I think that fear is a tool. And so depending on who's leveraging and wielding it, it can have a certain desired outcome. I find myself constantly trying to find my footing in the media landscape. Obviously, we're in a political season. The stock market has sort of been defying gravity. And I agree that a lot of what you said is actually true. So there's been this kind of concern around a recession. Maybe we're in a recession. I think the technical definition of a recession was maybe changed or updated. It's a little bit irrelevant, right? Because at the end of the day, everyone sort of goes about their business. They go to work, they come home, they have to feed their families. And the reality of the day-to-day life for most folks is just what it is. They have to accept it either way. So I think regardless of where we've been, we're still in a new environment. And that new environment is a place in which investment decisions and the way we do business is a little bit more scrutinized. Especially speaking with VCs and investors, their perspectives have changed drastically. Operators of brands, those that have exited, most top line growth has been flat year on year. And so that's a reality. The best brands are doing plus 2%, plus 4%, maybe in the best of case. So we're not seeing a ton of growth, especially in the D2C landscape. For consumer goods, certain categories, certain verticals are outperforming others. But there is a very real dynamic and a very real pullback in terms of discretionary spending. That is something that we're all grappling with. So regardless of the extraneous sort of messaging that's happening in the media and sort of the economist evaluations, the investment evaluations, all those things, it's a concrete reality for a lot of folks. And so on the marketing side, because we interface with the financial folks, and they ask us the tough questions around profitability and growth. Those conversations are very real, and I can guarantee you that that's sort of at the front line and at the forefront of everyone's thoughts around how they're positioning their organizations and what they're looking to do in 2025.
But there is that big challenge out there in the marketing space that the focus is all outward, right? Like, and that leaves a lot of most marketing agencies with the exact same vibe. It's like consumer goods, B2C, D2C, etc. Right? Like they have the leverage here. They've been doing this for a while now to be like that outward focused and to be that present. So, you know, for marketing agencies, for B2Bs, for etc. Right? Like, how do you see this changing?
There are certainly entrenched players, and there's legacy agencies, there's the holding co's, right? There's all these sort of players that have been around, and they would love for everything to remain the same, right? The status quo. And I think to some degree, even government prefers the status quo. And so everyone sort of favors it. Investors, of course, they don't want unpredictability and uncertainty. That's the last thing they want. So there's a heavily entrenched system. That the same goes with brands, right? So like the biggest brands in our space, there's a reason why they're in the Fortune 500 and everyone's investment portfolios and there's in their retirement funds. There's a reason why Meta is, the way they are is because they don't want things to change. And so the reality is that any brand that comes along, whether it be an agency, whether it be a B2B player, whether it be a direct consumer brand, they're up against a lot of headwinds. They're up against a lot of what I'm talking about. And historically, the bar to actually scale and the means at which you could do so meant that you had to have a certain amount of money. And that amount of money was actually pretty large. And so what it did is actually insulated a lot of these brands. And so the other thing that's happened historically is that if they have a competitor or someone that's coming up, they'll just buy them, right? So they, rather than deal with them and compete with them, if they have a strong offering and they have a strong trajectory in terms of sales and distribution, which is another thing. So distribution is a gated moat. Then they're up against a lot of challenges, and it's nearly actually impossible in a lot of senses to compete at those levels unless you're very determined and very stubborn. And I am both those things. So I think it takes a unique character and it takes a sort of ambivalence to the way things have been. And that's really, in my mind, what disruption is, because it's actually at its core not about money, because money is just a means of energy transfer, right? So it's like, I'm giving you money to go do this thing, or I'm buying these physical goods from you, but it's really at its core just an exchange of energy. And so what's interesting is that, when you find people that are actually principled and people that are determined and people that want to see things differently, that's when you see real disruption. And so the same applies for brands, right? Like if you're a brand and you get an offer from PepsiCo, and so they'll buy their competitors and remove the risk. And so given that context, we're just kind of seeing more of the same in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And I see that so much. Like there's so, we're in like this roundhouse that we both have a lot of passion for. It's like, even in the marketing space, there's the guerrilla marketing, right? In like, brand strategy, there's that positioning, there's that differentiation. But a lot of it really goes into the learning. We need to like go way back, and the conversations do need to go deep, because as you started off that reply, it was like, hey, a big part of the society, the ones who, government, etc., like the bigger corporations, they don't want others to get in like and stand out. It is hard, but it's not impossible. A lot of it, at the very base of it, I would say, is unlearning, right? Like unlearning that,
Yes.
we need to seek approval. We need to be following the same kind of approaches, the same kind of lines, right? And a lot of the time, like, and I know we spoke about this on your podcast, was like, hey, what are the other industries doing? How are they doing things differently, and how can we like integrate that? Like, if the ideation is not there, and from there, once you start having these ideas and going down this rabbit hole, it's easier to draw even more ideas and really pushing back on that.
I look to history because I think that if you take lessons from history, you kind of can see what maybe happened in the past and maybe how that repeated if civilizations and culture learned from the lesson or if they continued down that same path. You sort of look at the economic trends that have occurred, and I think a lot of it has actually favored the upper class. And so what that means is that the middle class has been squeezed out in a lot of ways. And I think that those trends are only compounding with some of the technological advancements. So AI, for example, the power and the concentration, the potential for concentration of power, actually has been incrementally exploding to where if everyone is gatekeeping, or if very specific spheres of influence are gatekeeping AI, then you can imagine that concentration of power shifting and being even more concentrated if everything's moving towards that direction. And so I actually think about, like I said, like about history, and I think about the Renaissance, right? So if you think about the Renaissance, the big lesson there was a certain status quo in place, which is largely to do with the church, and there was a very concentrated center of power, right? And so from there, it was really a great expansion of new ideas and new thinking that really started at a grassroots level. It started with the people, the scientists, the philosophers, the artists, and it wasn't. It had nothing to do with money, right? It had everything to do with deviation of the norm, breaking away from the way things had historically been done, and then from there, there was this explosion of new ideas, right? And so it's an interesting lesson, I think, for us where we find ourselves right now. I think a lot of people, especially the online folks and the trolls, they love to talk about the fall of Rome. They sort of equate the West and the fall of Rome as we're maybe in this period of time in which that could potentially happen. And so I think, just as easily could be a second sort of Renaissance type moment, because there are these extraneous factors and spheres of influence happening with AI and this sort of like break towards hyper productivity, hyper profitability, and all these things that we're sort of a little bit as being humans and having real human emotion and feelings, and sort of like the human condition. I think we sense that's a little bit of like there's some danger right there. Like we don't fully trust or feel like we're comfortable with it, right? And I think that's our instinctual nature. And so I think there's a real opportunity right now for people to actually regress a little bit, and step back a bit and say, just because we can doesn't mean we should, right? And just because we can go all in on AI or these other types of things, maybe we need to take pause, and maybe we can have some cultural revitalization around some of these things that are really meaningful to us, which are creating art, creating music, creating cool marketing, creating cool brands, creating cool businesses that are not just 100% profit driven and just thinking only about the bottom line.
That makes me think of the few brands that have actually they've passed that wall, right? That's been put in place, right? Like it's almost okay, yes. So like a glass ceiling, but for business, right? So like, Liquid Death or Gymshark or, you know, even Patagonia. They're like, okay, these are bigger brands that everybody knows, but I'm sure there's a lot of like smaller ones that they are, really gaining footing And the way that they've approached it, like, they started off from like middle, low class. Like, a lot of us can say like, hey, we're average people at heart, but there was like a certain approach. And I'm not going to say hack, because there are like, to me, what I believe, there's no hacks to this. It takes a while. You need to like have the right advice, talk to the right people, have the right timing, etc. Right? But like, there's something about their approach, right, where they were able to pass by that business glass wall.
I mean, the word ambivalence comes back to me, and I think that is a great word in the sense that it describes exactly how they maybe approach it. Because I think if you care too much, if you're online 24/7 and you're sort of just emulating what others are doing,
Yeah.
you fall into that trap. And so you lose the opportunity for differentiation. You lose the opportunity to actually tell your own story and create that. And I think that in a lot of ways, it's a huge missed opportunity, because a brand story is, and we touched on this in our podcast, whether you like it or not, whether you're a personal brand or a consumer brand, or creating the brand for your business, if you're not writing that brand, someone else is going to write it for you. And so if you're falling into the trap of only sort of thinking and sort of gauging your decision making around what's working for others, you're falling into that trap. And so what it means is that if you're so adverse to risk taking, and you're so tied to the numbers, or what's happening on a spreadsheet, that sort of organic leap of faith that can actually 3, 5, 10x you, and give you a very defined brand positioning and a real trajectory for growth over time, you're going to completely miss that opportunity. And once that ship sets sail, it's not coming back. That's the harsh reality of this whole thing. And so it's an opportunity cost, and it requires a sort of aversion to risk, a sort of devil may care type of attitude. And it requires that you take this a little bit of a reductive approach, both in your life, because if you're a founder, it's extremely difficult, right? If you're someone that is not paying yourself, maybe you're paying your team and you're reinvesting the money back into your organization. Those are really tough times. And so it's a bit of a walk of penitence, and it's really it's a harsh reality, but it's something that you essentially need to buy into, and you need to accept. And in the end, what happens is that those brands, like you mentioned, the Gymsharks, the Liquid Deaths, I know Chubbies is one. They make the men's shorts. At the end of the day, they have the bigger exits. They have the interest that they're driving. They have the engagement, because it really does happen organically, and it resonates with people. And so if you're telling that unique, engaging story, and you're not necessarily a clone or following the herd, then you're going to see the outcome that you're probably desiring.
When you step away and just go fully in that direction. Like, it's not a half-assed feeling, right? Half-assed direction towards that. And you know what? That kind of makes me think of your business name, right? So the name Impossible Machine. I don't know why, but it gives me steampunk vibes. I have no idea why, but like, do you want to share a bit more about the backstory and building that up, and the big goal that I know that you want to achieve with that? Because I know that follows a similar sort of line of thought of pushing against the norm.
I think that they say, the branding experts, and maybe even yourself, would advise to keep the name short. The name feels to me a little bit too long. It's like a mouthful. We're also a .io. Everything that we've done, though, is very intentional. It's really an expression of how we work, which is more so horizontal. It's less about a top-down approach. So I always use the example of Napoleon and the way that he conducted warfare. And I think that thinking about something like that, it really is a decentralized structure in the way that we operate. And so thinking about the way that he sort of organized his battalions. There's a general that he trusted, and it was asymmetric warfare, meaning that they were able to command their own troops, and they were able to make their decisions without reporting up to a centralized body. And I think that I'm certainly not a fan of war or advocate for war. I just think it's a good metaphor. But I think that if you're trying to break it down and understand it, it also applies to physics. So there's this idea of what the actual innate definition of what an impossible machine is. It's lossless energy, meaning that in the laws of physics, there's no energy gained and no energy lost in the universe. But when you actually apply those principles to something like a rocket or a plane or anything really that involves fuel and any sort of machine, there is a loss of energy. So it's a bit of a myth, right? It's this mythical thing that throughout civilization and history, people have chased to try to build. And so maybe if you're thinking about something like Atlantis or these mythical philosophical things that have existed in the past, maybe they cracked the code, but there's nothing that we necessarily have right now that can do it. And so what I thought about a lot, because I've thought pretty deeply about this, is that the interactions between people. So if you think about that at a core level or a base level, a little bit of what we do, because obviously we're born and we die, and there's this sort of there is energy that occurs. But really, if you think about it in the context of a system of people, if everyone is sort of sharing ideas and helping each other out and collaborating and bringing new thinking to the space, then that is a little bit of a lossless system, right? And if they're knowledge sharing, and if it's decentralized, and if everyone's empowered to make decisions and own their own futures and own their own path, then that's as close as I can think to a sort of lossless energy system. And so that's really what Impossible Machine is the idea that the energy exchange between people is lossless energy. And so it's true to our logo. It's true to everything we do, in the sense that we're this decentralized entity that is really an agency structure built and is intended to be future-proofed, to where it's really a network of people.
I know we talked about this before. What do you feel like our listeners can learn from strong stances and sticking to that one area and doubling down on it? Like, what are the best practices? And I know we were talking about the Hungry Jacks campaign, and having a strong opinion, sticking down on it. Shoot, tell me.
It's crazy. I think about Pareto principle all the time. So 80% of your business outcome is coming from 20% of your core customer base. So if you think about it in that sense, and of course, me being a media planner in the past, where I was having to manage $50 million budgets, it's worth considering, right? And so every organization can fall into the trap of trying to please everyone. That's very common. And you have this nagging responsibility, especially at the CMO or CEO level, of I just need to cast as wide a net as possible. I need to get as many customers as possible. I need to appease as many people, or likewise not offend as many people as possible. And so the risk is very real, especially if you're answering to shareholders, if you're a publicly traded company, or if you have these ambitious goals like we want to exit in the next year. Everyone's sort of sitting on pins and needles, not wanting to screw everything up if you've built something that's truly impressive and actually has momentum. So all that being said, you can't be afraid to break things, right? You can't be worried about the bull in the china shop. And the reality is that if you were to be having a conversation with someone that has a finance background, or is sort of the one that is heavily scrutinizing every decision because it could cost you, the exit or the company, what you need to tell them and remind them is that this argument is actually rooted in statistics and math based on the Pareto principle. And if you look at your customer data, if you do in-depth audience segmentation and targeting exercises and understand your customer to a T, then what you're going to walk away with is having a good understanding of who's actually driving your business. And this is a stark revelation. Excuse me. This is a stark revelation to a lot of these folks, because they sort of they haven't maybe done the work, or they haven't looked behind the scenes and really spent the time to understand their core audience motivations and desires. Maybe they have a basic demographic understanding, but they haven't delved into behavioral components or psychographics. And so there's so much more that you can uncover. And so when you mentioned the Hungry Jack ads, I thought about that in the context of it was actually a really lighthearted campaign. And so for me, I may not be the target audience, but what I understood from it, what I took away from it, was not necessarily being offended, but rather thinking that there's probably nothing that their target audience, if we're specifically talking about females, wants more than to just not give a fuck about anything after going through this traumatic, heavy experience. And that's very relatable, right? That's a very relatable thing. And that, to me, is what the ads were conveying. And so in that sense, and I think good advertising, when it's done right, it applies to universal truths. And that universal truth was very relatable. And I think it's very relatable specifically to their target audience. Again, I'm not sure that I'm the target audience there. So in that sense, it resonated very heavily with me. And I said, well done. I said, fuck yeah, you killed it with these ads, because it's very relatable.
So for anyone who's listening who hasn't seen these ads, it's had like quite a bit of it's had quite a bit of hoo-ha on LinkedIn, on socials, amongst the marketing, the ad, like community, like everybody wants to have an opinion about it, right? So basically, it was them showing mothers who have just given birth, like just a few moments ago, and then they've just gotten their first meal after giving birth. And in their case, like they gave them the Hungry Jack's burgers, and that was the photo, that was the ad there. And to me, the way that I see it is very much like, yes, they touched on that that desire, right? Like when you first give birth, and I haven't given birth, I have like I have no idea about that, but you want to eat whatever you want to eat. But what I drew from it was that it drew a discussion. And I feel like that in itself is a major draw factor for the brand, right? Like having that discussion, having those differing opinions. And heck, maybe there's those people that don't agree with that. But as a brand, you need to be okay with that, right? That there are going to be some people that don't necessarily agree and that are not going to want to buy from you. But it goes back to that principle that you're mentioning. It's going to be that 20% who will. You know, even you look at Taylor Swift, right? Like as a personal brand, or rather a musical brand, right? She has like a mass following of people who are like absolutely addicted. Then there's those people who are indifferent. And then there's those people who absolutely hate, and they'll just troll her for no reason aside from having too much free time in a day. I don't know. But to me, I see that as like they're doing something right, because you're extracting a feeling, you're extracting an emotion.
Yeah, Taylor's a good example, because I think that she is someone that has mass appeal, but also has a very narrow definition of who she's actually speaking to. And I think who she's actually speaking to is an adolescent woman, or maybe like a young teenager, or someone that's in their earlier years of their life, because a lot of what she sings about is heartbreak and sort of like dating and finding someone and finding yourself. And I think, so what's interesting though, is that I think that same messaging also applies maybe a little bit in hindsight, to where people they can relate to it in their middle ages, and maybe even in the older years. And so it's all very relatable in the sense, in the context that she does affect a wide audience, and that her message and her song lyrics feel very genuine and they're very sentimental. And so what they say is that nostalgia is one of the most impactful sort of emotions that you can feel, and especially if that's used as a tool in advertising and marketing, that it's highly effective. And so I think probably what's happening is that if a mother and a daughter go to the Taylor Swift show, maybe the mother is thinking back to those experiences, and they're also actually bonding over the shared experience, right, of both going through that. And it's about life lessons and teaching and growing together, and sort of having unconditional love, and all those things that I think there's a lot of haters, right? And there's a lot of people that are saying things like, oh, Taylor this, Taylor that. And it's like, okay, clearly what she's saying in her songs and how she's writing them, and everything is landing again with the target audience and who she's intending to deliver this message to. So in the context of marketing, we can say that she certainly is a job well done. She's not by any means missing the mark there. And so it's worth considering. I think, you can't be everything to everyone. I know we sort of touched on that a little bit in the last podcast, but it's definitely a mistake for a brand to think that that's the case.
Are there any brands in specific that you're inspired by, be it personal, be it like a business brand who's shaking things up?
And so that brand is Jolie. And so what they do is actually they create filtered shower heads. The way that they've approached it is a little bit in the sense that what we've talked about earlier in this conversation, where they've sort of been stubbornly and even a little bit maybe antagonistically attached to their way of doing things, versus kind of bending or trying to form or fit into the way things have been done historically. And so again, if we talk about disruption, those things are incredibly impactful. And then at a certain point, everyone begins to have the case studies and the Harvard Business Review articles. So not necessarily by any means a life-changing product, although they maybe would argue that they are. It's really about the positioning, the way that they've done things, and the way they've done things differently, similar to a liquid death, how, this sort of idea that water in a can, that's pretty easy to copy. And it's certainly, while it has certainly improved, the means of recycling and the idea that we can sort of reduce waste and all that, at the end of the day, it's really about the brand and the persona and the alignment of values. So similar to that, with Jolie, I think that they've done things very, very differently from the start. They don't offer discounting. They actually provide value in other ways. So when you sign up for their email and SMS service, you're actually given a water report that's specifically tied to your geolocation. So rather than offer discounting and sort of these traditional models, they're providing value in a different way. And they've kind of stubbornly clung to that. And so their audience is someone that is middle, upper income or above. It is not necessarily an inexpensive product, but at the same time, it's attainable. So it's a little bit aspirational in the sense that, it can appeal to mid-market as well. And so what they've done, obviously, they've done in-depth audience analysis and research, so they understand who their core customer is. And then what they've done is sort of reverse engineered what that experience can be for those folks. They've taken a problem solution framework, so they've applied that across the business in totality, and they've done it very, very effectively. And so I think too, when we talk about in the last podcast, we talked about how you can take a reductive approach to some of this stuff, and in terms of what it means to be a brand. And so they're not trying to do too much. They're not trying to appeal to everyone. Their message is very distilled down. It's very concentrated, and it's very specific. So it's not overly complex. It's easy to understand. The headlines are short and punchy. The copy is short. The lifestyle photography is really good, high quality. You can easily understand the value of the product and why it's important. And that's a win. And so it's easier said than done to get to a place like that as a brand, because there's a lot of things you can focus on, a lot of shiny objects. There's a lot of things a brand can be, right? And so, but if you have guardrails and you think in terms of taking a reductive approach, in terms of let's get rid of everything extraneous, everything we don't need in our messaging or in our photography or in our ads, and really just concentrate on what's moving the needle, that's a winning formula. And so that's kind of what I think about in terms of one example of a brand that's doing really good.
What you mentioned there is something that a lot of companies that, whether I'm speaking to the founders or the marketing heads, the people that are coming into the company later on, is that market research part, that really defining of that audience, that's not quite there yet. Either it's not been approached or it's been pushed let's push it back, because it does take time. But at the end of the day, you get those kind of results like Jolie they've had. They're speaking to one audience, and therefore that one audience is reacting, right? So that leads me on to the last question I have, and it's one that I ask everyone who comes on the show. That is, what is the biggest societal norm that you want to push back on and teach others about?
It's very comfortable to live a comfortable life and to not question things, to not necessarily want change or to want things to be drastically different. The acceptance of the status quo. I think that it's really easy to do because everyone sort of falls into this routine. And so maybe you have a really good life and maybe, you're even part of an organization that isn't necessarily interested in disruptiveness or any of the things that we've been talking about. And so I get that because I've been in that seat and it is very comfortable and plush. But the reality is that if the majority of people are sort of not questioning things and kind of just sleepwalking through life, the reality is that there's never going to be a chance to improve things. There's never going to be a chance to try different things. There's never going to be a chance to open the gate for more folks, more entrants, more brands, more service businesses because of the reasons we outlined earlier. So it's really the actions that you take day to day, the small micro actions, or just the seemingly inconsequential decisions that people make on a daily basis that really have the biggest impact. Because what happens is that those actually compound and add up over time. And you could imagine if you were to multiply that over tens of millions of people across the US or the globe for that matter, that's the way it works. And so there are sort of grassroots movements and things that happen and pop up here and there. And I think that when those things start to happen, maybe the entrenched players become alarmed and they try to sort of crush whatever it is that's a threat to them. And so the only way that the perpetuation of those movements or those sort of organic uprisings of wanting change or wanting things to be different, the only way that those actually carry momentum forward is it starts with the people, right? It starts with people actually picking up those causes that are important to them. And I don't think it necessarily means that you need to go out into the street or protest or do anything of that nature. It's really just more so about how you live your life day to day. And so people talk about voting with their dollars, right? And so if we're talking about a company or a disruptor brand like a Patagonia, for example, you can choose to support someone like that or an organization like that that does business a little bit differently. And over time, what happens is actually it carries more weight, not even necessarily inside of that organization, but extraneously to other organizations, because what it does is actually sort of normalizes the way that they're doing business. And it opens up more opportunity for others to enter the fold and do things differently. And so it's not even just about Patagonia in that sense, right? It's about everyone in the context of this discussion. And so it may not feel like you're doing anything monumental or impactful if you're purchasing from a brand like that or advocating for them for that matter. But the reality is you are, and it's easy to forget. It's easy to lose sight of what it means. And so the best thing you can do, and this is true in business and life and with anything that's important to you, is to be consistent. And I think that when I think about my journey as a founder and starting a business is extremely hard. And the thing that's the most uncomfortable is that you feel like you're doing things that aren't necessarily moving the needle too much. And you also feel like this sort of mundaneness or the day-to-day becomes a little bit routine, a little bit too repetitive. And so what you need to overcome, and this is the most difficult part, is that consistency factor. It's showing up every day, asserting your beliefs, saying, this is what I believe and this is why, and then carrying it on, carrying through with what it is, and sticking with your why, and staying motivated, even on those days when you're not feeling your best, or if you're sort of uncertain why I'm being so championing of Patagonia, right? You kind of like lose sight of that in the shuffle of the day-to-day. And so if you remind yourself, if you come back to those things regularly, I mean, for me, I do it daily through different ways. But if you really assert yourself and stick to those principles, the same applies to a brand. If you're trying to be a disruptor brand, if you're in those meetings every day, reminding everyone in that room of why what it is you're doing matters, and you have alignment and you have buy-in across the organization, then after a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 20 years, you're going to have completely revolutionized the space. And so it's easy again to lose sight, but if you can maintain consistency, you'll get there.
Absolutely. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs, founders, business owners talk about this. Like you see this in social media, like that message, like just keep being consistent, keep going at it. But it's not said enough, because really it is like something that we face every day, because you're just like, I'm not saying it. And like, at a certain point, then you start like, oh, wait, hang on. Let's see, like, over the 2 years, and I do think like it is making sure that you're actually looking back and being like, oh, actually, and celebrating like those small wins. Anyhow, thank you so much for coming on, mate. And you can check out the podcast show notes for ways to connect and learn more about Chris and what the team at Impossible Machine is doing. And if you love the episode, a great way to support you, the episode, is by popping a 5-star review, and learn more about how you can level up your brand perception at badassstraightbybeat.com. Let's freaking go. Whoop, whoop.
Time for bloopers. Yay!
Well, you know what I like to think of myself of is that old Wild West door that people used to throw open. It's kind of like a half door, but it's kind of just more like a gate you pass through and you fling it open. Maybe that's the kind of unhinged we are.
Or you kick it. Oh yes.
Or you kick it, or you shoot it. You do whatever.
Well, I mean, I'd have to use my baseball bat, obviously.
Or you send in the kangaroo first. Kind of. You know what? We're gonna use AI. We're gonna create this whole scene at some point. I don't know when it's gonna happen, but we're gonna use like runway, and we're gonna have animations, and we're gonna actually bring this to life. That is my promise to you as an agency owner and a creative disruptor.